Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us worldwide. We have a very exciting panel today. I'm joined today by Zoe Whitley and Pasternak, Phil Tinari, and András Szántó. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you who've watched this before know the format. I'm going to start with an individual question. Then I'll have a group of questions to the panel, and then I'll have questions from the audience. We'll take questions from the audience via the Q&A function, which you see at the bottom of your screen. Zoom is great for many things, but this is the thing it's not great at. Last week we had 161 comments and questions, which was just unmanageable. So I would ask that you please, A, hold your questions till the end, because it will have a better chance of being answered, and B, hold your comments until the very end. We promise we'll read them, but the more comments we get, the fewer questions we can handle. For the first time in this Zoom series, we're very delighted to offer this in simultaneous translation into Mandarin. So simply choose that audio channel at the bottom of your screen if that's what you'd like to see. You'll see a little globe that says interpretation. So if you want to hear it in simultaneous translation to Chinese, hit that button. This week, we're pivoting from galleries, who are the topics of our first two panels, to institutions. And I'm not really a religious person, but today is Ascension Day, so perhaps it's the perfect day to talk about the resurrection of museum scenes after lockdown. And this is happening, as with the galleries, in a very ununiform way. For example, museums in Europe opened as early as the beginning of last week, sometimes with a very different set of health and safety measures, but they're open, as are many galleries. Phil's museum, UCCA, opened yesterday, so I'll be looking very forward to hearing what the first 48 hours was like. In general, I would say by definition, museums are places that strive to attract strong crowds and often rely upon international visitors and domestic group tours. That's going to be harder in the near future and maybe much longer. I have to say the complexity of being a museum director has always intimidated me when I think about the jobs that you do because of the incredible range. I think you have to be able to deal with short-term crises and do very long-term planning for your shows under normal conditions. And today, again, that sort of complexity is daunting because I imagine that you're facing questions that range from the hyper-practical, like where do I get plexiglass for my cashiers and my cafeterias, to the totally philosophic, like what role should institutions play in the post-COVID cultural landscape, assuming you can even guess what that landscape is going to be. So, we have before us three people who are facing these complexities, and one person, András Szántó, who is trying to help many institutions as they work through them. I'm going to start with Zoe. Zoe Whitley's the director of London's Chisenhale Gallery. Formerly, she was at the Hayward, the Tate Britain, and Tate Modern. She co-curated the acclaimed 2017 show Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, really a definitive show in terms of defining a certain period of artistic production. She also most recently curated Kathy Wilkes' fantastic British Pavilion at the Venice Biennial, an event which will be canceled or postponed for a year. So you're in a pretty surreal position because you were appointed at the Chisenhale just after Christmas. You were supposed to start at the end of March, but your museum is currently closed for an indefinite period. How do you start charting a new path under these incredibly strange circumstances?
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for having me, Art Basel. I think that's precisely the question. We joked when we were kind of preparing this that what might rank as like the world's worst hypothetical interview question. If someone was with you, like, how would you lead an organization remotely in the midst of a global pandemic? And you'd think it was so absurd as to not even really be able to entertain it. And yet here we are. So yes, we had to take the decision in mid-March that the safe thing to do was a necessary period of closure. And so I began leading the team from my apartment on the 30th of March. And I think what a lot of artist friends are calling the Great Pause is really contradictory because there's a pause in so many ways of what we think of as business as usual, but it's an accelerant in so many other ways where, to your point about the role of institutions and what our missions are, we have a responsibility to rethink how we remain relevant to our audiences. Everyone, I think there's been a real rush to digital. And so one of the things that we did first as a team, obviously because I'm so new, there is a certain amount of just trying to listen and to learn. And by refocusing, kind of doubling down on the mission, there were a number of things that became clear that what might otherwise be perceived as a rush to appear decisive and make decisions actually meant a period of consolidation. A lot of people here in London who don't have the luxury of second homes or leaving the area were under an extreme amount of anxiety. And one of the things that we felt we needed to do was to acknowledge that, not only within our team, but also for artists with whom we're close, whether that's artists who were concerned about what might happen to their exhibitions. And so it was very important for me to make clear that we have an obligation to all of the artists in the program, that we were going to commit to deferring and rescheduling their exhibitions, and that we're in, frankly, a luxurious position as commissioners or co-commissioners of new artworks, where we didn't have to make a choice of saying, well, we can no longer honor this commitment. So we're taking a longer view with the program. And in the short term, with what we're doing online, we have one basic goal, and that is to support artists. And a lot of times that means monetarily. So what would have been our public-facing program, we've been able to divert those funds to support artists, in some cases not projects that we've initiated. So Taishani, for instance, is part of a really innovative team doing a series of DIY artist films on Twitch. And so we are coming on board as co-commissioners of their second series and trying to promote the first series as much as we can, because so many Chisenhale alumni are a part of it. But basically just trying to think very clearly and closely about what our mission is. And if we believe in artists and want to support them, then everything we're doing in this moment is directed toward that.
Great. Thank you, Zoe. I'm going to go to Anne now. Anne Pasternak has since 2015 served as the director of the Brooklyn Museum. I don't have time to name all the great shows she's done, but I mean, one of the funny coincidences is that Soul of a Nation actually came to the Brooklyn Museum as well, and I think it's reflective of the way in which Anne's museum has really had a direct relationship with its community and with the borough of Brooklyn. Prior to joining the Brooklyn Museum, of course, Anne was famous as the president and artistic director of Creative Time, with whom we worked on many occasions. For more than 2 decades, and I think at the time Creative Time was really one of the defining nonprofits and within the artistic landscape, and always intensely political, at the intersection of art and social practice. You serve a city, Anne, that has been, and specifically borough, I think, that has been one of the hardest hit worldwide. And in comparison to Zoe and Phil, your institution operates at a radically different scale. How does this pandemic change your thinking about your mission, about your modus operandi, both short-term and long-term?
Thank you, Mark, and it's good to see you, and hello to everybody who's tuning in, and I hope that you all are healthy and finding moments of peace during this insane time that we're living in. Thank you, Mark, for having me. And it's an excellent question. Let me just say that for those of you who've never been to the Brooklyn Museum, it's one of the oldest and largest art museums in the United States of America. And it has a significant collection in a giant old Beaux-Arts building. And we're situated in the heart of Brooklyn, in central Brooklyn, which has been among the hardest hit in New York City and therefore the nation. And we are surrounded by working class families who are facing unprecedented amounts of, or I should say not since the Great Depression, amounts of unemployment, anxiety, fear over their futures, health trauma, and huge problems with food insecurity, grief, and the list goes on. And so it's really important that we remain or even become a stronger community anchor in service of our local community. The social good was always a part of the DNA of the Brooklyn Museum, Mark. It was founded at a time period when Brooklyn was an independent city. And by the way, just to give people a sense of scale, if they don't really know Brooklyn well, if Brooklyn were an independent city today, we'd be the third largest city in the country. So it's a big place and a rich diversity. But at any rate, it was founded to help educate young men who were immigrants to this new country, to this new city, with the idea that if we understood each other's cultures, we'd be better neighbors, we'd be better citizens, and we'd construct the ideal American project. But I digress. But those roots have been extremely important to us throughout our history. We've always relied on them. And the ethos of empathy and care and learning continues to guide us today. So as we deal with what the realities of our local communities, which are very painful, we're diving in. We created a virtual a task force of our board and advisors and beloved community members and staff to look at our community response. On June 1st, we'll be partnering with the Campaign Against Hunger, beloved local organization that served as a food pantry, to distribute food to our local community because food insecurity is a really huge issue. We're looking at the ways in which we can help young people accelerate their paths to learning, because about 30% of the young people in public schools in our neighborhood have been missing since the schools closed. And we have absolutely a social responsibility as an important community anchor to help do something about it. So we're looking at all the issues our communities are facing, and we're responding as we always have.
I mean, in a sense, then you're the perfect person at the perfect institution, because of your history in the museum's institution. But you still not. It feels like are there specific ways in which you think the museum will run differently 3 years from now than it would have otherwise?
Oh yeah, I have been very inspired by how libraries and what we used to call the Bronx Zoo, but the World Conservation Society, have really reinvented themselves. So libraries like the Brooklyn Public Library, when they were facing a crisis, sort of an existential crisis, as more people were reading on Kindles or learning through the internet, they went from being places where you distributed books to be places of learning. And that learning completely expanded. I mean, you can learn to be a citizen. Through the libraries today. You can learn all sorts of things, cooking classes, etc. And I don't think that museums have an existential crisis at all, but I still think that there is a lot to learn in terms of how others have more generously embraced their important roles. The World Conservation Society, we used to call the Bronx Zoo, went from being a place where you can see, monkeys and elephants to being a place that is about protecting the natural habitats of all the animals that we can see there from around the world. And it became a place of advocacy and learning and care. And so I think there are other models for museums to take a look at, like us, to help inspire how we have an even broader reach, how art and creativity and inspiration is able to bring more people in and to advance the ways in which we get engage.
Okay, we'll go into more of that later, I'm sure, because
okay.
It's a multi-layered topic. I'm going to go to Phil. Phil's, UCCA opened yesterday, and Phil's been the director of the UCCA in the 798 area of Beijing for the last decade. When he took it over, it was a private museum, and he's turned it into a museum which is really professionalized across multiple locations, is part of a public foundation now, has a series of art-driven enterprises as well. So, I mean, Phil, you've had a transformative role there. And we had a conversation before, and you were, we talked a little bit about how having strived to make the museum operate in a more planned, specific, orderly kind of way, you're suddenly faced with this chaotic element of touched off by the crisis, this kind of whitewater environment. You reopened yesterday, having closed in late January as planned for Chinese New Year. What have the last 2 days been like? What is it like to come to the museum? Maybe not just to enter it, but if you're a visitor who's coming from downtown Beijing to UCCA, what is that like? And what did you have to do to set that up? And how has it been to have people come through your door for the first time in 4.5 months?
Thanks, Mark, and great to be here. Yeah, it's kind of ironic because our opening coincides with an event that's happening in Beijing right now, Beijing Gallery Weekend, which had historically been a kind of stop on the way to Art Basel, Hong Kong. It was, people on the kinds of itineraries we used to all find ourselves on, multi-city tours, people would come to Beijing and then make their way down. And of course, things are completely upset this year. It was in early March already, we were starting to get wind of when a reopening might happen, thinking quite far out. And we got this date of May 21st as the time when this weekend would happen. And because, we're located at the center of the 798 Art District, which is really kind of like the emblematic zone for contemporary art in Beijing, and I guess even in China more broadly, I sort of felt that it was quite clear that our shows on the calendar for this year, many of which involved intense overseas collaborations, were not going to happen as scheduled. It was also clear that there was really no way we could get to May 21st and not have something to show everyone. And so, yeah, I sat in a room with my curators for about a week, and we came up with an exhibition that we've titled Meditations in an Emergency, after the Frank O'Hara anthology, which kind of looks at the post-COVID world from 5 different angles, everything from the disappearance of everyday routine to the relationship between humans and animals to the proliferation of a sort of decentered, polyphonic or contradictory narrative around news and information. So it's a 26 artist group show. That's actually, if I don't mean to brag or anything, but it's really beautifully installed, and it's poignant, and it's just so wonderful to be back in physical space looking at art with people. Now that can only happen because of larger dynamics in the society, and to say nothing of different countries' relative methods for confronting this pandemic and roles in its origin and spread. Beijing now finds itself very highly protected, of course, being a political capital. Today's also the opening of the 2 sessions, which is China's legislative once a year meeting, which always brings with it increased tensions on all fronts. But to even enter into 798, one needs to have their temperature taken, and one needs to show a kind of virtual pass, which is generated by a government app that tracks your data and proves that you haven't been in any high-risk areas for the last 14 days or 21 days, and even in some cases syncs to facial recognition thermometers that are around town. So it's there's a complete panopticon, and we're the indirect beneficiaries of it. So at our door, there's another temperature check, as there is at the entrance of any restaurant or store. But masking here is completely mandatory and universal. And so then it just becomes a question of how to be responsible and keep things disinfected, and use our guards to keep people distanced. But I guess all to say that we're all kind of working inside the contexts where we find ourselves, and this one, for the draconian nature of certain measures, they paradoxically allow for the freedom to enter into a public space and look at art again now.
So what's the mood like, both within your staff and within the visitors?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was thinking about I was taking a Zoom call from our front desk this morning because like time zones, and I got out of the car and didn't want to lose the Wi-Fi connection. So I was just sort of sitting there watching people like mill around, some of them coming for the gallery weekend press conference. I would say there's like a certain solemnity to just everyday existence now. So people are ready to come, and in a way that's maybe not the worst frame of mind with which to enter into an exhibition. You know, and then there are moments of levity and normalcy, but then you also, I mean, I always think like one of the first times I went out to a restaurant after this, you know, things started to open up again, you know, entering into the lobby of like the hotel where the restaurant was and realizing, you know, yes, things are normal. We are going to this dinner, but like if this were a normal Friday night in late March or mid-April, this place would be crawling. You know, there'd be people everywhere and there'd be so much going on. And now, you know, everyone who's here is here with a very specific purpose and for a limited duration. So there's just like, I think it's kind of like, I've been calling it sort of like the new intentionality. And I think that applies to programming as well. You know, I mean, it's not that we won't continue to do big international shows, but we'll do them for specific reasons with kind of very measurable goals and, you know, in more measured ways.
It just suddenly struck me, does the new intentionality mean that people are using the exhibition less as a backdrop for selfies, or
No, that's still happening. Yeah,
okay, well, one can always hope. All right, onwards. András, you're a cultural strategy advisor to museums, foundations, educational institutions, major corporations. You've worked with us at Art Basel, you know, cards on the table, on projects such as the Audemars Piguet commissions and the BMW Art Journey. You recently published an article, and I know there's a follow-up coming, called People Need Art in Times of Crisis. That's why museums should be among the first institutions to reopen for business, and here's how. As many people know, as far as I know, unless something changed in the last 24 hours, culture is like a phase 4, which means last to open category. Obviously, everyone on this screen and presumably everyone in the audience disagrees, you know, vociferously to this, but I'm curious, you know, in your role as both a formal and informal advisor to a wide range of institutions. In fact, you just came off an all-staff call coming into this Zoom. From a big picture perspective, what are the key issues that are coming up around the reopening? How do you, if you were to sort of break them up into broad categories, what would those be?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to everyone. And I can't wait to walk over to the other side of the street. I happen to live across the street from the Brooklyn Museum. And just to state the obvious, we desperately need these institutions, not just for the objects, but for everything they provide. And yes, we will get through this. And yes, great admiration to all the, not just the institutional leaders, but the board members, the staff. This is a Herculean effort to sort of, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, rebuilding the aircraft while it's in flight kind of situation. It's a really an extraordinary complex logistical challenge among many other things. Just a few points, because I know we're eager to get into the meat of the matter, but I think what you said earlier, Mark, about the combination of unbelievably minute issues like, do I need to change the you know, hand drying machines in the toilets, to the most mission and vision based issues. The confluence of these two things is what defines this moment. Every institution has to, in addition to solving these very practical dilemmas, really look deep inside and think about what it's really here to do. What is it for? And to do this partly because it's a response to the moment, but also, let's face it, the budgets will be smaller, the staffs will be smaller. So like any family or any individual in a moment of crisis, you really have to look in the mirror and think about, what is this really all about? What is this intentionality really all about? The other thing I would say, and just a few things I want to say, is there's no one size fits all solution. Museums are in a stunningly wide range of circumstances, from big institutions in hot zones like Anne's to rural institutions with giant parking lots and low attendance. There's no central guidance, of course, in the United States. We don't have a cultural ministry. So to some extent, everybody has had to figure out what that means, but there is no one formula. The third thing is that this is not just a practical question. This is a psychological issue as much as it's a technical issue. And I'm sure that the three directors on this call understand that it begins with the psychological issues with your staff. In order to have an institution open, you need a staff that's willing to and is able to come to that institution and feel okay. And people are not okay. And of course, you've got a community around you in many cases, as in Brooklyn, which is itself heavily traumatized. And those issues cannot be taken out of the equation. Fourthly, there is no business rationale for reopening a museum right now. The moment you reopen, you're going to be losing money, as it were. And I think this is testing a lot of issues in museums because these are big organizations. They are nonprofit businesses. It's very hard to know that for the foreseeable future, this is probably a loss-generating proposition. This is a mission imperative. It's not a business imperative. It's as simple as that. A fifth quick point, this is not a one-off moment. I think what we all realize is that we need to retrofit museums, not necessarily because now we'll have a pandemic every year. Let's hope not. But it's a little bit like airport security. You know, it's something that is going to be implemented and will stick around. And we have to figure out ways perhaps not only to adapt to this moment, but if in the future there's a next wave or a different pandemic, hopefully we don't have to be closed for 2 months before we can do the essential work that we do. And finally, about this question of essential. I think, you know, Anne was talking about libraries. I do think that this is a moment to assert that we're essential, which is why I'm a bit worried that on the one hand, we're closed. On the other hand, we keep saying we're essential. But how we are essential, how we fill that role is the question. And I think here there's a very encouraging aspect, which is that this field of museum field has been engaged in a deep discussion about who we are for a long time, shifting in that sort of library direction that Anne was talking about. So I think the good news in all this is that it's accelerating perhaps a process of a movement in the direction of a kind of museum that is more open, more community minded, more locally minded, more rooted in its own local realities in a way that perhaps wasn't always the case before. So I'll leave it at that for now, but those are some of the big picture issues that we see.
Great. Thanks, András. I have a few questions for the panelists, although I want to get pretty quickly to the questions from the audience. András, you talked about this sort of local focus, which I think everyone has been, you know, most of us who are now living in one place are suddenly spending a lot more time thinking about what that place is and how we contribute to it or don't contribute to it. So on the one hand, we have this trend, at least short term, towards a more localized thinking. On the other hand, as Phil mentioned, you know, things like international blockbusters, which have been a big topic within the museum world for a while. And I mean, and you know, I don't think it's always a negative thing. I think it's great when a show, like Zoe's show travels from the Tate to the Brooklyn Museum, because it has an amazing value for both of those museums' audiences. But I think, do we see, and this is a question, maybe I'll throw it to Phil because he mentioned it. How do you see the museological thinking towards blockbusters shifting to the extent that you can generalize, or how are you thinking about it differently, you know?
Sure. Well, I mean, we as a sort of Kunsthalle institution that has learned to generate a lot more of our own revenue through ticketing, are of course looking forward to a time when we can, you know, mount another show like the Picasso show we did last summer. I also think that in the context where we find ourselves, where people haven't had substantial opportunities to see work by some of the great figures in person on their home turf, that there's a very clear rationale for doing those kinds of shows. But what's kind of interesting in a moment like this is, I mean, I was just sort of walking around the show we opened yesterday, and really just thinking of it. I mean, yes, there is this sort of, as András has written about it, a local turn, but it's not necessarily like the reactionary close the borders, you know, get rid of all the foreigners kind of turn. It's more, I mean, about, I think, thinking more intelligently about, you know, about the way that international networks can function without constant travel. And so, for example, I mean, we have pieces in this show by Shanna Moulton, by Pierre Huyghe, by Wolfgang Tillmans, by you know, and by lots of artists from Taiwan and Hong Kong also who couldn't access Beijing at the moment. And, you know, so much conversation has happened around moving exhibitions online, but, you know, one thing to think about is actually just installing exhibitions offline using the online, right? So maybe you don't need to send that team of technicians. Maybe more can be produced locally. You know, maybe there are just, you know, maybe we can use Zoom not just for panel discussions, but to, you know, check the height of, you know, how a room is hanging and how a projector is working. And, you know, continue to do what we do best, which is to create, you know, solidarity and proximity by, you know, arraying works of art in physical space, but maybe just with a kind of deeper understanding of where that space sits and how it might function and what kind of role it might play in people's lives.
And I'm going to put you on the hot seat because obviously, you know, your institution both receives and initiates a lot of major international shows, not only specifically within the art world, but also, you know, shows that more touch on the music world, like the Studio 54 show or the Bowie show. I mean, what's your take on this? Has your thinking shifted, or tell me?
You know, I'm going to say something controversial, Mark.
Good.
I think that the dismissal of blockbusters in the art world is a form of snobbery. And I have to question why we don't want people from all walks of life coming into our institutions to celebrate culture that, you know, that has been important and influential. So I'm a fan of the blockbuster. There, I've said it. And listen, let's be honest. I think for every museum around the world, our exhibition calendars for the next year went into the trash pile. You know, of course, as Zoe said, we're staying committed to our artists. Maybe we're deferring exhibitions, you know, but everybody's calendar went into the trash pile. And I think that while over the next year or until there's a vaccine, we won't have blockbusters because we can't, you know, put a lot of people into a space. I do imagine that blockbusters will be part of the solution for many institutions moving forward, right? Because we want to reset people's habits. They've been isolated, they have social hesitation. We want them, as soon as it's safe, to come back with roaring enthusiasm into our institutions. Our museums are important. They should be coming back. And I think blockbusters are going to be a part of the answer.
Okay, good. András or Zoe, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I just want to say two things. I mean, this is a very knowledgeable audience you have here, but I'm sure you know that when it comes to these international blockbusters, it's not just the cost. It's the couriers, it's the insurance, it's the export rights, it's the, you know, so many other things that make this not just financially, but also logistically very difficult. So, you know, understandably, there's some triage going on. But at the same time, I also want to make a big case for, I guess, what I would crudely call cultural diplomacy. Because one of the essential roles, I think, of museums is to serve as a counterbalance to some of the very adverse political tendencies which we unfortunately see happening in our society. The borders closing, the xenophobia, the othering, all of those things that are happening in our midst, and which unfortunately this situation is catalyzing, even while it's also catalyzing collegiality and collaboration and a lot of good things. But in this respect, I think this is an irony that even though it's difficult for us to do these shows, never have they been more needed than now. Because we really, you know, the museums are one of those institutions that can help us not pull apart from each other right now and to help us understand each other. So I think as soon as we can, let's do it in a smarter way, perhaps. Let's do it in You know, maybe not every picture needs to travel. I want to mention that a few weeks ago, the art newspaper did a big conference on replicas. You know, until the 19th century, the way we experienced the arts of other nations was through plaster casts. When the Met Museum, which is now, should have been celebrating its 150th anniversary, you entered the Met and you saw a hall full of plaster casts of the great European sculptures. You know, and people accepted that as a form of culture. Now we have not only plaster, we have virtual reality and you name it. Is it a full substitute? No. Is it a way of telling stories about other points of view? Absolutely.
Zoe, a lot has been said. Do you have anything you want to add on this?
No, I think that in addition to what Anne's saying about the kind of full democratic and egalitarian accessibility of Blockbusters, I think one of the things that this moment has kind of thrust us all into is a kind of force quit, because it can be that the Blockbuster is a default. So institutions of comparable size and comparable operating budgets could work together to create something that would be mutually beneficial for all of them. And actually, at a certain point, you know, Picasso was mentioned in Phil's case, for instance. Certain artists are more of a draw than others. And I think that in this moment, what a lot of institutions are going to be doing in ways that are really generative and productive is going back to, for those institutions that have collections, thinking about how their own collections can be represented and reinterpreted, remixed for the kind of hyper-local audiences, how bringing in an artist to inflect something to bring a new perspective onto what's already there becomes an interesting approach. So I do think that both of those things can coexist, that the Blockbuster will no longer be the answer to everything, but it will make for some more creative and lateral thinking where that was, I think, particularly from the 90s onward, this kind of default for a successful model of exhibition making. And I think that we're having to rethink that in ways that will actually benefit how people engage with their institutions locally.
Zoe, I really want to thank you for that, because that's absolutely correct. It's not as if, you know, these mega exhibitions are the only thing our institutions are doing. And, you know, we closed the day before we opened the Studio 54 show, which was going to be, you know, our huge exhibition of the season. But a month earlier, we opened 5 collection-related exhibitions, you know, climate and crisis in relationship to indigenous peoples of the Americas, Jeffrey Gibson having a fresh look and take at how, about Native American identity, Kehinde Wiley with Jacques-Louis David. And so I think that these strategies, to your point, are essential, that there's this kind of wonderful stew of opportunities and keeping the collections alive and drawing more audiences into them.
And if I may just build on that, as a neighborhood resident of Anne's, it's not even just the exhibition program. And it's not even the educational program. It's the public spaces around the museum. You know, my kids, you know, when they were younger, used to play in the fountains outside of the Brooklyn Museum. One of the things I'm most excited when the Brooklyn Museum restarts is maybe one day having a space outside the museum where the community can gather. So there's, in fact, when we think about museums in the language as we now use of placemaking, of being a community hub, these are all parts of this larger idea of the new museology. These actually have nothing even to do with exhibitions or even collections. They have to do with the social functions of the museums, which surely are now going to be dialed up in this situation. I think here is where there's so much promise and opportunity for institutions to explore.
I'm starting to see questions build up from the audience, and I would encourage the people who are watching to start throwing in some more questions, because I'll come to you in a few minutes. Museums, in a moment where everybody, including Art Basel, has been doing a lot more live programming, a lot more digital programming, has rethought what it does online. Museums have been one of the probably, or perhaps the part of the art world that's been the most dynamic in terms of getting out there, doing things, etc. You know, and in a sense, it makes sense because, you know, if you can't do exhibitions, how else do you get yourself out there? I'm curious what your experience has been in terms of this pivoting towards pretty much pure digital presence, you know, both in terms of as a producer and also as a consumer. You know, what's been challenging or exciting for you to do, and what's been exciting for you to see other people doing? I'll start with Zoe.
I see we have a lot more participants that have joined since the kind of kickoff question. And I think there are a couple of things that have been really interesting for me. And a lot of them do come back to a politics of care and of slowing down. And because so much of our professional lives and personal lives are now mediated through a platform exactly like this, I'll say personally that, you know, I often don't want to have the screen in my face afterward. And so I've been doing a lot more listening. I feel really proud of a commission that we very recently launched with Lydia Roman, who created a playlist to sleep to. And it's a really beautiful thing on SoundCloud. And it has a much wider reach than what we might think of as a kind of typical contemporary art audience. And that's been really wonderful to see how internationally it's moved because of the accessibility of SoundCloud. And also, again, just looking at the ways in which, through a platform like Instagram, for instance, something that might otherwise be irritating, we take what, you know, used to be a chain mail, and the way that many artists are paying forward, selling their works to buy other artists' works. And so this real sense of direct action where a need that is very acute can be met in many, many different ways. Wolfgang Tillmans, for instance, and many other artists around the world, when we come to it, I saw that Storm asked a question, but a number of South African artists are also part of a very big initiative where an open edition is available, and it's deployed for many, many different charities. One of them is an emergency fund for art technicians, which I know many people and I personally really care about, but equally hospitals and food banks, and the fact that we're seeing crises in so many different areas, but that artists have really shown themselves to be first responders in a lot of ways, has been something that I've drawn a huge amount of inspiration from, to see how this work that exists can live in the world and circulate for the benefit of others.
Other thoughts on the onslaught of digital programming, both that you have to produce and that you have to sort of wade through? I'm curious, sort of, one question I have is how much of this do you think will continue afterwards? You know, like I would hope to continue this kind of conversation online from the Art Basel perspective long past the crisis period, but do we see this as a temporary fix? Do we see this as a transition for something that was going to happen anyway? How do you see it, you know, Anne, what's your take on that?
Well, our lives have already been increasingly screen-based. And I think that this is just one giant leap forward in that reality. I absolutely agree with Zoe. At the end of the day, the last thing I want is to have my computer open again, because I'm on the computer from 7 in the morning till at least 8 p.m. and then I'm just done. But a lot's not true for everybody. And, you know, I think one of the things that we're learning is that what seems like the thing to do one week is already dead the next week. I mean, you know, as soon as the crisis began, everybody was talking about virtual gallery tours of the museums. There was a huge spike in participation, and then the next week it plummeted off the cliff. So I think we're all in a period of learning about what is going to work, and it has to be integral to the mission and the programming that we already do. I think this is one of the silver linings, actually, of this crisis, is that we all should have been much more virtually oriented to share our mission and our work globally. And I think that's a good thing, but I think we really have no idea where this is going to settle right now. You know, I was about to start 2 weeks ago a series of conversations, and then everybody was doing a series of conversations, so I just canceled the entire program. It's like, you know, you plan for something one day, it feels like a great idea. And then the next day you're like, ugh, I had my cup of coffee, time for a reset.
But now here you are on this conversation, and thank goodness. I just want to say I've been thinking about this in a following way. I think we've been stuck between two not great alternatives. And I think there's a third way. The two not great alternatives were a closed museum or a very compromised museum experience. B, a lot of stuff coming out of a screen, most of it repurposed. And by the way, I pause for a second. 3 cheers to all those museum leaders in the last 10 years who've digitized all this content. Well done. Turns out we need it. But it's not satisfactory. And as you see, it's already a little bit getting stale. I think the third way is where the real innovations have been happening. And that's that space between the screen and the closed museum. A very good example of this was the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, which in the middle of the absolute worst period sent out and created projections around the city onto the sides of these wonderful Bauhaus buildings that they have, for people to enjoy, to see. You know, obviously it could be mediated, but a lot of interesting things happened. You know, the Getty Challenge to make people do stuff at home, even some of the social service activities of museums, you know, the garage opening a food drive. You know, these are things that happened in these times that were not strictly virtual. They were sort of between the screen and the closed door of the museum. And I think that's the most exciting space that I see. Some of that is digital, some of it is actually not even digital.
You know, András, related to that, there was something we did a week ago because we realized all these kids are graduating from high school, right? And there's no graduations, and their variability to be able to go to college is maybe even more questioned now. So Instagram came to us with Anton Sargent with a partnership, and we in 4 days turned around a competition of teens and college-age students sharing with us the artwork that they've been making, and we gave out 5 prizes of $5,000 each, which was really a great thing to do to help young people at this moment. And, you know, you can imagine those kinds of efforts growing and growing.
Yeah.
I'm going to start taking questions from the audience because I don't want to keep people too late, and we have, as usual, far too many questions to answer. One repeated theme in the questions has been the notion of collaboration. Last week's panel was about galleries collaborating. And I think there's been a trend towards more collaboration between institutions recently, but do you see this spiking or changing in an interesting way? I'll start with Phil, because you're sort of the farthest from everybody else, but I'm at, like, what kind of global conversations are you in with your colleagues and peers?
Well, I mean, I've been on countless Zooms with like the museum directors assembled in different cities, just because, you know, it sort of played out here beforehand. So there's just been a lot of like operational curiosity about what, you know, what this means, like how far along the road we are. But that's kind of nice because it's not, I can't, I mean, Zoe and I were just on a call at 7 o'clock with like the assembled museum professionals of London. And so I don't know, there are some fun conversations that grow, you know, on the sidelines of these big chats. But I guess, no, I think that's something I hear from a lot of colleagues, is just that this has actually brought us all to talk to each other a lot more than we ever really did before.
Are you seeing, like, okay, in the gallery world, we saw collaboration between a group of galleries and Sotheby's, you know, which is something that nobody ever expected to see. And I think we're seeing a lot of things. That's the most extreme example, but we're seeing a lot of things that we never thought we would see. And I'm curious, is there anything in the museum world that has struck you as sort of unimaginable 6 months ago in terms of collaborations, discussions, that kind of thing? Anybody?
I don't think, I think museums have been so paralyzed to some extent that I don't think that you've really begun to see that. I mean, at a local level, I'm sure it's true of every city that, that there is a lot of coordination and the discussions. But I think we will be seeing more collaborations between institutions. I would like to say that there's maybe some of these barriers are also going to begin to evaporate inside institutions. You know, there is a big moment of opportunity here, forced upon people, but nonetheless a moment of opportunity to look at operating structures of museums. many museums are going to have to make do with significantly diminished staff members. And so I think that you're going to see flatter management structures, maybe less siloed structures. And, you know, insofar, you know, some of this may be painful adjustment, but there was a lot of talk about similar issues after the '08 crisis as well. You know, how can, you know, if in fact, for example, educational functions, community outreach, and all these functions become more critical, and digital and all of that stuff, which really got elevated in this crisis, then what is their place inside, and how are processes playing out inside museums? I think those are the kind of questions that are going to be occupying museum leaderships in the next phase.
Another question, which is interesting, I think, at least in the short term, is traditionally galas have been a big part of how people raise money, you know, and the question is, do you see galas playing as important a role? And if so, how do you stage a gala in the era of social distancing? I mean, it's been really it's not just a way to raise money. I think it's also a way to kind of federate the community, to transmit a certain thing about the identity of the museum, to bring into the mix the artists that you're closest to. Like, what is the future of the museum gala? Phil, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, that's like one of those wake up in the middle of the night things, because I'm not sure we've completely confronted the reality that, you know, the first Sunday in November for us this year might not be, you know, what it has been these previous years, and yet, you know, it was always like there were a few years where our gala represented a kind of inordinately large percentage of the annual pie, and we've been trying to move away from that in all kinds of different ways, because you know, it's just a risky thing to have so much riding on one night. But I think I agree completely with what you said, that an event like that really also does exist to articulate a community and to represent a kind of vision and value system. And of course, there are plenty of other ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. Anne, you've done your fair share of galas. What's your take on that?
I love a party. I love throwing a great party. And I think that galas are going to remain a very important part of what we all do. We're going to have a hiccup over the next year for sure. But there's nothing beats coming together in celebration of a mission and an institution you love. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think it's going to be extremely important moving forward, but we're just going to hit the pause button for a little while. And I do want to say that our colleagues in the performing arts space have found a way to do this very, very brilliantly. And it's been inspiring to see how the performing arts world has pivoted, and they face far greater challenges than museums do. We're set up to be great places for social distancing, right? But, you know, theater companies, for example, or any place where you have to be seated is a big challenge. And so even despite those challenges, the performing arts organizations of all types have really risen to this challenge.
Right. Zoe, you're based in Europe, and obviously traditionally people have thought of Europe as a place where institutions were less dependent on the private sector and benefited more from public sector support. I know that's shifted in recent years, but you know, as you think about your institution and that those of your colleagues, how much more difficult do you think it's going to be to get the kind of governmental support that has sustained institutions in Europe historically?
I think we've got a massive challenge ahead of us. I think there's no way to mince words about that. And I do think that's in many ways related to your previous question about fundraising, because if we take a gala as like a metonymy for what it is we do, and I really like the way Phil put that, you know, arraying artwork in physical space, that the gala or a dinner or any kind of coming together becomes something that is both cultural and social. It's something that people look forward to. It's this moment of gathering that is designed to bring people together, and that the virtual is never going to be able to replace completely. So creating those moments in particular for philanthropically minded individuals as a way to acknowledge them and thank them in person, as a way to bring people closer to the artists and who and what we're excited about in that moment. I think that we're still trying to find ways to do that. It's difficult being in this far north in the Northern Hemisphere, knowing that we'll have fewer opportunities when the weather's not as good as it has been to maybe do that outside or to think in other ways. But again, it's something that we can't entirely do without. So it's a really fundamental challenge. I know that many of the arts organizations like Arts Council are really trying to do what they can now to support those organizations that are really on a knife edge right now. And so those that have perhaps benefited more in recent years from individual support or from trusts and foundations are going to have an even tougher time moving ahead, because for individuals, I think much will be asked of them. And of course, no one person can support a whole cultural industry. So a lot of this creative thinking around how we work together, around pooling resources is something that's going to happen. And I think for the first time in a long time, what it's effectively going to mean, like to actually address the question that you've asked, is that instead of what has been a relatively slow attrition of frankly phenomenal ways of nonprofit organizations doing more with less and less and less, we're also going to have to do less. And that doesn't mean we won't be ambitious, but it may be that one given exhibition has a longer run, that, you know, over the course of a 2.5-year period, what might have been 15 shows becomes 12 or 10. And so it may not be that people feel a massive loss in terms of the substance, but that the mechanics of the thing are going to have to change, because we aren't going to be able to have the same output as before. And I think we will have to think very differently about even the rhetoric of how we market ourselves, being the first or the only. It may be that collaborations happen within a given city rather than only international ones. So how we work and support artists, you know, if that's fundamentally what particularly those of us who work in contemporary art are caring about, can find ways to refresh the model, but it won't be easy.
Yeah. András, you work with a lot of institutions in different countries. I'm curious, and monitor them. I'm curious how you see this question of how you balance out what will doubtless be a drop in governmental funding in many places for the arts.
Well, I think it's about the case you make. It's about, you know, the vision you put forward. And I think it goes back to what I think we've all been talking about in this conversation. You know, even before we got into this pandemic, the ICOM, which is the International Association of Museums, had been engaged for a year on writing a new definition of the art museum. And if you ever want to study museology, just look at the story of this definition. This is now, it's a little bit of a groupthink effort, I would say, and it bears the marks of that. But, you know, in the old days, you went to sort of museum school and they told you that museums are about, you know, collecting, preserving, interpreting objects, or whatever that line was. Well, now there's a whole string of words that are added to that. In fact, in the last ICOM definition, I think the last thing that museums are also supposed to do is make sure that planetary well-being was one of the things that museums were also working on. But the serious point here is this, that if you can make a claim for a public value, that is to say, you're not an elite institution only for people who have the great privilege of having studied art history. You're not just for the, you know, upper 10% or 1%. If you can make that case that you have a public benefit, you're going to be better positioned, I think, vis-a-vis government funding agencies. You know, you will never win the fight about should we give money to the hospital or the museum. You will always lose that fight. But I think you have a better chance when you have an opportunity to put forward an expansive vision of the museum as something that really contributes to the welfare of its community, getting over this trauma, making sense of it, providing services, providing a third space where people can commune and gather and all of those things, providing educational services, that will help unlock, I think, public dollars and pounds and whatever currency you're using. And I think it will help unlock some of the foundation money as well, because most of the big foundations here in the US, unbelievably generous system, but in the last decade have moved away from sort of straight up, let us support your exhibition or, those kinds of things. So I think it's really about what is the case we make about what is the contribution of a museum to society at large. That's the big question.
So I'm going to try to pull together a few different themes. I hear Zoe saying we have to learn to do less, not just do more with less, but less with less in a sense, and I think of Glenn Lowry saying a week or 2 weeks ago, we're going to learn to be a smaller institution, MoMA of all people saying that, I think of myself at Art Basel and all the things we've layered on, this and that and the other thing. And I think we all expect that galas will be more difficult, the government funding will be harder to come by. But then I think of Anne saying at the same time, we have to do more, and the question is, inevitably all of you, and I'm going to start with Anne because I think she runs, the largest institution on the panel and one of the largest, in the game. How do you, and we know, I don't know what the numbers are for the Brooklyn Museum, but we've seen museums, radically drop their budgets, furlough a lot of staff. How do you go through the exercise of preparing to make the case, as András has put it? How do you go through the exercise of really saying, this is our core mission, this is what we're spending on, this is what we're not spending on, these are the things we're going to do more of? Because it's, when you, whatever you're doing, whether it's an art fair organization or a museum or any other kind of, productive entity, the exercise is not just how do you do less in a time of crisis, but how do you do even more less so that you can do also the things you have to do. I know that was an entirely ungrammatical sentence, but Anne, knowing me well, knows what I'm trying to say. So Anne, how do you do that?
Well, Mark, I couldn't have actually said it better, and it was as if you were pulling out the jumble in my brain. I mean,
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, on the one hand, you have this this passionate desire to open the institution because we believe in the power of our institutions to inspire, to relieve pain, to contribute to healing, to help us understand the moment we're in. So there's an imperative that we open, right? Then you have the safety issues, which would basically say the health issues, don't open. Till there's a vaccine, do not open. And then there's the financial things. And if this was a Venn diagram, nothing would meet in the middle. And then you have the reality of other outside forces like public policy and the global economy, et cetera, which are going to have such long-term, you lose all control. So you have all these complex factors that you're trying to incorporate into your thinking. And, we're an institution, sadly, that's used to working in a bare bones way. We're scrappy. We try to have a good sense of humor about it. All the philanthropic dollars of New York City, only 5% goes to Brooklyn. It's insane. It's insane. And sobering, and this is historic. But at any rate, so, we're used to being scrappy. We're used to being innovative and coming up with solutions. But I have to say, this is a very hard challenge. This is a very hard moment to lead. And the only way that we can make decisions really is by listening to the most rational input, which is probably the CDC and the World Health Organization. So we're planning around, periodic intermittent closures and probably one major closure. It just seems like that's the safest, most rational thing to do in an irrational situation. And to really use our gut, because in a moment like this, you don't have much more to go on than your decades of experience and your intuition. And so, you just have to make the best decisions you can, and you try not to sacrifice your service to your audiences and your community. And other things are just going to have to be put on pause for a while so you can do the most important work.
We're 5 minutes into overtime, and I'm seeing our numbers start to drop. I think I'd like to stop on Anne's, focused, pessimistic, or realistic but optimistic note. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. This will be, for those of you who missed it or who want to tell friends about it, who want to watch it, or who missed the beginning of it, if you want to watch it, it will be on YouTube tomorrow with any luck. Next week, we have Noah Horowitz, our Director Americas, who will be speaking also on Thursday afternoon with 4 collectors about what they're doing, as collectors and as patrons. Fusun Ejebaj from Istanbul, Jill Krause from New York, Carlos Massana from Latin America, and Uli Sake from Switzerland. At this point, I said before, please don't put your comments into the Q&A because anyway we couldn't get through it. But at this point, if you have comments that you'd like to share with our panel, with Art Basel for future, as constructive criticism, please put them in now. For updates on this series, which will continue, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Weibo, and WeChat. And last but not least, thank you so much to our panelists. I thought that was great. We could have gone on for hours, but I think a 2-hour Zoom is just too exhausting and you have other important things to do. For the audience, stay safe, stay sane, and remember to support culture by all means necessary. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you again to the panel. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.